Welcome back to the Criticizer of Conlangs with your host James Pigeon, and today the episode is on Latino sine flexione. Latino sine flexione was created in 1887, published in 1903, and finalized in 1914 by Italian mathematician Giuseppe Peano. He published it in an article, De Latino sine flexione, written in classical Latin, but he gradually stopped inflecting it until it became LSF, proving to the reader that simplified Latin was perfectly understandable if you already spoke perfect Latin. In fact, Peano was so cocky about LSF being good that he published his mathematical treatise in it, which apparently just caused nobody to read it. Peano soon became pretty big in the community, being elected president of the Académie Internationale de Lingua Universal in 1908, who were using idiom neutral, which will probably be covered sometime or another. Eventually, they started using LSF, but it split into countless idiolects, and Peano tried to standardize it, and it died. In terms of phonology, LSF is pretty standard, probably not too hard for most people, but I don't like the glottal fricative, and the differentiation between aspirated stops is weird, but besides that, it's fine. So vowels are just a 5-vowel system, with the inclusion of U for some reason, and 2 diphthongs less than in Latin. Although, because all the vocabulary is from Latin, one can assume that U and K and T and P are only in Greek loans, so it's fine. In terms of orthography, it's obviously the Latin alphabet, with 7 digraphs, 2 for diphthongs, the classic QU, and 4 for Greek loans, like in classical Latin, mostly. This is fine, no notes. Is what I would say if LSF didn't have phonemic stress in 2 tenses, which is completely unmarked for some reason. Grammar is simple. Unlike real Latin, verbs aren't conjugated based on who's doing them. One just drops the ending of the infinitive, like amare to ama. Passive participles add a suffix, progressive adds a suffix, you know the drill at this point. I mean, the whole point of the language is in the name, Latino sine flexione, Latin without inflections. So to really have to explain it that deeply, it's Latin without inflections. And you changed a bunch of other stuff to do counting. The tenses are simple for a European: past, present, future, conditional, perfect, guided, and progressive. And like in real Latin, there aren't any articles, but Peano said you could just use illo, isto, or hoc for the definite article, and uno for the indefinite if you really need it for some reason, which is how the Romance languages got their articles in real life. So pronouns also don't decline, like the no he, him, who, whom distinction. They just exist as me, te, illo, illa, id, nos, vos, illos, and se. So vocabulary, well, it's just Latin, sine the flexione, right? Not exactly. Peano decided to use the Latin ablative root for some reason, but with a vowel ending based on one of the 5 regular genitive endings. Yeah, Latin has declensions, but it also has 5 noun classes, which all decline differently, and this affects the noun in Latino sine flexione. The result of all this is usually the same as the ablative anyway, but it's not universal. Anyway, what this means is that even if one knows the nominative, how Latin nouns are presented in most dictionaries, one still has to decline it into genitive and ablative, remembering the class, then apply the proper ending to get the noun in LSF. Personally, if I was doing this concept, I would just use the nominative, simple as. It's what most people who took Latin in primary school would probably remember first if they remember anything. I'm from the US, so we learn a useful language in school like Spanish, but you gotta respect the English for drilling respect for the classics into the youths. Although, it's weird that they're the ones who are like 8% Catholic and we're almost at a quarter and they have to learn Latin. Anyway, for adjectives, you have to know if the neuter form in Latin ends in e or that has special rules for some reason. And if not, you just do the ablative genitive thing. So yeah, this language is super easy if you're already fluent in its source language. Now for the segment where we take the 8 languages with the most native speakers and see how recognizable 2 random words are. Patra is close to padre, obviously, and kind of like father and pita, the 2 other Indo-Europeans. And Portuguese pai is just 2 derived anyway, but decent showing. Again, pace is only recognizable in the Romance languages in English, which is Germanic but uses a Latinate root here. But is this really fair? LSF wasn't trying to be recognizable to the world in its vocabulary. It's just Latin. So how about we test it again, but with only Romance languages? If anything, this should be able to work as a Romance zonal auxlang, right? And Most Romance languages that aren't named Sardinian are just too derived from Latin at this point to be super recognizable, especially French and Portuguese being addicted to dropping consonants, and especially French, again, for absorbing like 50% Germanic vocabulary. But yeah, it's a fine showing in this arguably more appropriate test. I'd say Padre, Papa, Pare, and Patri are close enough, but Pai and Tata are too derived. And for Pake, they're all pretty good, except Haitian Lape, which I would assume is a conjoining of the French Lapin with the definite article. But a native speaker probably wouldn't figure out that etymology in a short enough time to be useful. But why don't we ask a Latin speaker what he thinks of this language? And you know who happens to be a friend of the channel and speaks very good Latin? The guy who made Ishkrin, Wilhelm Succulent. Let's get...
Salvete spectatores, mihi nomen est Wilhelm Succulent et Latine loqui possum, non bene sed quis curat. Hodie de Latino sine flexione loquemur. Latino sine flexione est lingua constructa quae pulcritudinem Romanam delere temptat. Loqueris ne periocum. Nunc iratus. Itaque nihil prorum dicam. Gratas ubi sago.
And for the spoken sample, Pater Noster, contrasted with real Latin to its immediate right and English to its far right. Nostro Patre, qui es in Galus, que tuo nomini fi sanctificato, que tuo regno adveni, que tuo voluntate es facto, sicut in caelo et in terra, da hodie ad nos nostro pane quotidiano, et remite ad nos nostro debitos, sicut et nos remite ad nostro debitores, et non induce nos in tentatione, sed libera nos ab malo. Amen. Overall, Latino sine flexione has a pretty simple grammar, and keyly for an Anglo or Western European, it's pretty easy to read, but for literally anyone else on Earth, they're just cooked. In order to form the nouns into LSF, one basically has to know real Latin due to the weird conversion rules Giuseppe set up, so they can't just look up the nominative in a dictionary. They have to know the ablative and the genitive and the class and probably the gender of every noun they want to convert from real Latin to Latino sine flexione. Also, just mark the stress, the Romans literally... In the end, LSF is obviously more creative than communication sprock, but I can't in good conscience put it any higher. In a vacuum, it's probably a better language than Manmino, but in terms of meeting its goals, Manmino is a way better East Asian language than LSF is a world language. If Peano had just declared it a Romance zonal oxlang, it would be a number 2, but he didn't, so it's not. And stay tuned for next week, where the episode will be on Unish.